Well, hey there, everybody. It's your boy, Mr. Perry. And here we are. We're going to get into Unit 5, Lesson 7 in just a second here. But before we get into it, I'm going to ask you to just read over what the little bit of code that you see right here and ponder this question: why does this program have a person counter? So go ahead and read through it, read through the little class header, the instance variables, and then the constructor, and see if you can answer to yourself, why would a class like this want a person counter? So I'll let you pause the video, I'll let you read over it. And I'm assuming that you paused the video and that you had the chance to look over it. So this lesson is all about what are static variables and static methods. So let's go ahead and get into it. So going back to our person counter class, or our person class with the person counter instance variable, some classes have what are called static variables, as well as what are called static methods. And in this case, we have the person class, and every person object will have its own name, email, and phone number. But down here, we've got public static int person counter, and hopefully you understood that, every single time we call the constructor, we're going to go ahead and pass in some parameters for name, email, and phone number. But then the person counter variable is just going to go up by 1. So every single time we call the constructor for a person class, every single time we create a person class object, this counter is going to go up by 1. So that's why this one has a person counter variable. And we're going to understand what static means and all that kind of stuff. So let's talk about what is a static variable. When it says public static int person counter equals 0 and then person counter plus plus, what does this actually mean? So static variables are variables that belong to the class itself, as well as all objects of that class. It is not an instance variable because those belong to each object of a class. When I create a person object, that object is going to have a specific name, email, and phone number. And then when I create a second person object, that one is also going to have its own unique name, email, and phone number. So those are instance variables because every time I create an instance of that class, it belongs to those variables belong to that particular object. But a static variable is different. A static variable belongs to all instances of the class. It belongs actually to the class itself. So they operate a little bit differently, and we use them to store different information. Now, there's only one copy of a static variable or a static method for an entire class. And you always know whether a variable or a method is static because literally the word static appears after public or private. So private int num sides, this is obviously a non-static instance variable, but public static int num of shapes, this is a static variable that belongs to the entire class. So it's that simple. You just, if you see the word static, that means it's a static method or a static variable. If you don't see the word static, then it is non-static. So let's look at a quick table here that just kind of breaks things down, like the difference between static variables and instance variables. So static variables belong to all objects of the class, not to any specific object of the class, whereas instance variables, they belong to a specific instance of a class, and every single object has its own copy of private instance variables. Static variables are shared across all instances of the class. There's only one copy of a static variable, regardless of how many objects of the class are created. Whereas with instance variables, those are unique to every object, and they are used to store the state or the properties of that individual object. So there's multiple copies of those variables because every single time you create a new object, you also create new copies of the instance variables. Static variables are very useful for storing constants or shared resources, like the number of objects created from a class. Instance variables are a little bit different. They are marked as private, and they are marked as private to restrict direct access, but instead you use getter and setter methods to manage their values safely. Static variables can be private or public. You'll see them, in either case, and it just kind of depends on what the variable is designed to do, whether or not it should be kept private or public, but very often static variables are labeled as public. And then finally, static variables can be accessed using the class name. So it would be the class name dot variable name, whereas instance variables can only be accessed through a get method. So it would be object name dot get variable name. So there's definitely, quite a few differences between static variables and instance variables. And I like to think of static variables kind of like a class level whiteboard, where every object can see it and every object can modify it. And it's kind of similar to a public scoreboard in a game. If you go to a game, there's one scoreboard that everybody can look at, and it keeps the score for both teams. And so, there you go. There's a couple of different ways that you can think of static variables. Private instance variables are more like personal journals, where every player or every object has their own, and they keep their own private info, or they keep their info private unless they share it through a public get method or a set method. So, there's a couple different ways that you can think of the difference between a static variable versus private instance variables. All right, now let's talk about static methods. So static methods get called using the following structure. You've got the class name and then the method name. So math.random, of course, is a static method. Temperature.printMaxTemp is a static method. And then animal.printCount is also a static method because you can see the class names right here as indicated by the capital letters. Now, static methods are usually used to count how many objects of a class have been instantiated, or to access the upper or lower bounds of a value. So for instance, a static method hotel.print max occupancy. So max occupancy would be a static variable for a hotel. And so if I wanted to print it, I could create a static method to go ahead and print that static variable. And the same thing is true with the animal class. If you wanted to print the count, you could create a static method that is printing the static count variable there. There are a few rules though that we need to be aware of with static methods. Static methods only have access to other static variables and other static methods. So static methods are somewhat limited in terms of what they can do, which is why a while back when we did the string methods challenge, what we had to do in order to make that work was, because we were working in main, which is a static method, if we wanted to go ahead and call a method, another method in this class using whatever input we're getting from our users here, we had to, in order to be able to call this method, it has to be a static method. So we had to say public static string, concat string, and this will go ahead and take in two string parameters and it'll concatenate them, and then it'll go ahead and return them and print them here. But again, in order to make this work, because main is a static method, if we're going to be able to call another method, that is in this class, we also had to make it static. So static methods like main can only call other static methods if it's going to be within that same class. So there is that. Static methods cannot access or change the values of instance variables, and static methods cannot call non-static methods. So that's another limitation to them. So in here, we've got public class shape, and it has an instance variable of num sides. If I tried to create a static method to add a side or to add a certain number of sides to this instance variable, this would cause an error because, again, a static method cannot access instance variables. So that would cause an error. Also, static methods cannot call non-static methods. So if I had my get num sides get method established, and then if I tried to create another static method to add sides, again, based on a certain number of sides, if I tried to say this dot num sides equals get num sides, so in other words, I'm trying to call the get num sides method from within this method, this would also cause an error because, again, this is a static method, and a static method cannot call a non-static method. And it also can't access instance variables. So this one would have a couple of errors in it. And then finally, non-static methods have access to everything. Non-static methods can access all variables, including instance variables or static variables, as well as all methods, regardless of whether they are static or non-static. So here we've got the movie class, and it has one. I've got this kind of condensed. It just has one instance variable for the title, but then it's got one static variable for the number of movies. And then we have a non-static get new movies method right here. And this is a non-static method that can go ahead and it can access new movies, even though this is a static variable. That's okay. Non-static methods can access both the instance variables as well as the static variables. And then down here, we've got public static void print new movies. And this is going to go ahead and print the number of movies. And there you go. That would go ahead and work okay. There's a syntax error here. Obviously, I'm forgetting the, I'm neglecting the closing parenthesis, but you get the idea. Non-static methods like this one right here can go ahead and access everything. So that is all good to go. And then down here, public int my method, print new movies. So if I wanted to, I could also create a non-static method that would call this static method down here, and it would go ahead and print the number of movies, no problem. So again, a non-static method can also call a static method, but a static method cannot call a non-static method. So those are some important things to keep in mind. So with that all in mind, let's go ahead and try a problem from the College Board. I want to go ahead and encourage you to pause the video and read through. We've got a class over here called Sum class, and it's got a couple of variables here. Here's your constructor. And as you can see, we've got a couple of, we have a method here, we have another method here, and then another method here. Now, the following code segment appears in a class other than Sum class. And you can see we're creating some objects of the Sum class class, and then we're calling these methods that are over here. So assume that this is the first time the code in Sum class has been used. What is printed as a result of running this code segment right here? You can see it ends with a print statement, and we are printing third.getY. So again, pause the video. Carefully read through what's going on here and then what's going on over here. Make a guess as to what you think is going to print, and then go ahead and return to the video, and we'll see what's going on. So at this point, I'm assuming you've paused the video, and we can go ahead and start working through. So we got to take note of a couple of things. You've got in the Sum class, you've got your private instance variable x, which is initialized at 0. And then you have a private static variable called y, which is also initialized at 0. So at the beginning of this program, y is set to 0. Now over here, we are creating an object of the Sum class class. And so if you look at the constructor, which is right here, public Sum class, it takes in this parameter 10 as px, and it goes ahead and sets it to the instance variable x, but then y goes up by 1. So y is now 1 when you create this object. Now we're going to create another object, which is going to do the same thing. It's going to cause our y to go up to 2. This value of 20 is passed in as the parameter px, but that's just set to x, which is the private instance variable for this object called second. But when we call the constructor, that causes the y to go up again. So now the same thing happens here. When we create the third object, the constructor is called, y now goes up to 3. And now first.increment y is our next method that we're calling. And when we call increment y, it just makes y go up by 1. This is a non-static method, so it has access to this static variable. So y now goes up to 4. Now we're going to look at this next method called second.increment y, this time with the value of 10. So increment y is an overloaded method. We have another version of it here where we can actually include an integer. So now it's going to add 10 to our value of y with that method call here. Finally, we get to our print statement where we are calling third.getY. So even though we called this method with first and this method with second and this method with third, remember that y is common to all of the objects of the class, and they all have access to it. So you can go ahead and call get y with the third object, and that will go ahead and print 14. So hopefully you came up with the answer of 14. If not, hopefully this cleared things up. But obviously we're going to get a lot more practice with it in class. Let's go ahead and finish things up with our lesson review. Static methods and static variables include the keyword static before their name in the header or the declaration. And they can be public or they can be private. Static variables belong to the class, with all objects of the class sharing a single static variable. Static methods are associated with the class, not objects of the class. Static variables are used with the class name and the dot operator, since they are associated with a class, not objects of a class. Static methods cannot access or change the values of instance variables, but they can access or change the values of static variables. And of course, static methods cannot call non-static methods. So with all that, guys, we've come to the end of our video. Thanks as always for watching. Don't forget to leave a question or a comment, and I will see you in class.